Once again, my name is Amy Janess. I'm programming coordinator at the Atheneum, and it's my great pleasure to welcome our speaker tonight, Dr. Helen Scales. Dr. Scales is a marine biologist, writer, and public broadcaster. She's the author of Spirals in Time, The Secret Life and Curious Afterlife of Seashells, and Eye of the Shoal, a Fishwatcher's Guide to Life, the Ocean, and Everything. She teaches marine biology and science writing at Cambridge University and advises the marine conservation charity Sea Changers. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Helen Scales.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Amy, and thank you all so much for coming. It's such a pleasure to speak to you from across the Atlantic. I am in Cambridge, England. It's a very hot evening. It's been a boiling hot weather over here the last couple of days. So just the idea that we have a big, deep Atlantic Ocean between us makes me feel a lot cooler than I actually am. So I'm very, very grateful for that. And I'm thrilled to be here tonight to talk to you about my latest book, The Brilliant Abyss. And what I want to do for the next half an hour or so is to transport you to a place where none of us will probably ever get to go ourselves. But it is a place that is full of extraordinary wonders. And I'm just going to put up some pictures. Hopefully this is going to work for you to see. Yes, so here we are, the Brilliant Abyss. And this place I'm going to take you, as I say, is somewhere where up until, well, not so long ago, maybe about 200 years or less, it was generally thought that this realm of the deep ocean was basically a huge empty void, that nothing lived there at all, and that conditions for life were just completely inhospitable. But we now know, and we are in a golden age of discovery in the deep ocean, showing us that really this is a vibrant living space. There are extraordinary living wonders in the deeper, darker parts of our ocean. We are learning so much about what lives there, how these incredible ecosystems in the deep ocean work, and more we're finding why and how this hidden part of our planet is incredibly important for everything else. So even for us out here on land, life in the deep ocean really does matter, and there are all sorts of connections between the deep and our daily lives. So what I want to do first, though, is I want to help you, well, wrap your head around the vast size of the deep ocean and get a bit of a feel for what it is that I'm talking about. Because the thing about the deep is the huge size of it really is kind of an important factor in terms of understanding the challenges of life down there. So what I want you to do is imagine with me that we are all going to board a sailing ship, and we're going to sail off the coast. Let's say we're going to sail off the coast of Nantucket, why not? And off to a part of the, so we're floating above a part of the very deepest ocean. Deepest parts of the ocean. I'm going to take a normal glass marble, and I'm going to, just the kind of thing you might have, well, back in the olden days, kids would have played with, and I'm going to drop it over the side of the ship. And I'm going to tell you and show you what's going to happen as it's falling down through different parts of the ocean, as it's falling vertically downwards, and how long it's going to take to get through various different layers. Because one thing also about the deep ocean and everything beneath the surface is that it's not all just one big space that's all the same. There are important differences between the layers that we find as it passes down. So our marble is going to start off in the sunlit zone, the top of the ocean, the part that we know best. Scientists sometimes like to call it the euphotic zone. It's basically the part of the ocean where the sun still shines, and it's roughly the top 660 feet or so. It's the part of the ocean that we know the best. It's the part that we fish the most, that we feed ourselves from. It's the part we swim in, the part we dive in. Really, it's the most familiar parts of our ocean. But it's really just the very, very top of this extraordinary realm that we have, the aquatic realm on our planet. So our marble is going to fall from that surface where I drop it off the side of the ship. It's going to take about 6 minutes to pass through the sunlit zone. And then it's going to enter the deep ocean for real. For the official beginning of the deep ocean is at around the 660 feet mark. And that's when it passes into what we call the twilight zone. Now, this is the realm of the ocean down to about 3,300 feet. This is where there is still a little bit of sunlight coming down from the surface, but it's a very dim blue light. So, in fact, I'm just looking out the window for me here now. No, we're a bit too late, actually. Probably about half an hour ago here in the UK, the sky would have had this lovely, deep, inky blue colour after the sun has set. You know, that wonderful twilight colour that, especially when there's no clouds, you get this lovely clear blue. It's kind of like that the whole time during the day down in the twilight zone in the deep ocean. And already we're seeing in this realm incredible life occupying this space from the 660 feet down to around 3,000 feet mark. Things like this Dumbo octopus that I've got on the camera for you here. So we do have extraordinary life down through the twilight zone. There are enormous shoals of fish that make their own lights. We call them lanternfish. There are probably billions and trillions of them swimming around, possibly the most abundant vertebrates on the planet, but we don't get to see them. Jellyfish, all sorts of things swimming around in this wonderful twilight zone. Now, I should say that the marble's going to fall down through this zone, and it's going to take around half an hour to keep going all the way down through that. Then it's going to enter the midnight zone. It's going to drop into the midnight zone, which extends from that 3,300 feet mark down to around 2.5 miles. And this is where there is no sunlight at all in the deep ocean. So those last blue rays of light, I should say, all the other colours have been absorbed in this sunlit zone, and it's just the blue light that makes it into the twilight zone. And then everything is absorbed by the water by the midnight zone, and there's no sunlight left at all. And this is a huge, deep realm, but it is full of life. There may not be any sunlight, but actually there's all sorts of creatures that make their own light in the midnight zone. Now, this slide is just a few of them. It's a few of my favourites, actually. These are all types of worms. Distant relatives of earthworms that we might find in the garden, and their relatives actually moved down into the deep ocean and were crawling around on the seabed, and then these ones evolved to swim up into the water column, and they spend their entire lives swimming around, making beautiful patterns. They swim with immense agility and grace. These ones on the left-hand side, the one with the red stripe and the one with the yellow stripe, these are both types of what we call gossamer worms. The scientific name is Tomopteris, but I love that the gossamer really describes them beautifully. They're gelatinous, you can sort of see through colours, and yeah, they're incredibly agile. They spin pirouettes around, they can swim forwards and backwards with equal ease. Really beautiful things. And then the other guy on the left-hand side down, the right-hand side down here, this is one of those creatures that has a pretty good name. I don't know if you can see that, but it's the swimmer worm. That's just the scientific name is swimmer because it swims well. But, you know, sometimes you just call it what it does. And what I want to point out with all of these animals that live in the midnight zone, and many, many others, is that they have this ability to make their own light. They're bioluminescent, and it's an incredibly common feature for animals living in the deep ocean, in the deep ocean open waters, deep, I should say. Something like 75% of all animal life in these open waters have the ability to make light. You might just be able to make out here on the swimmer worm down here that it's got these green orbs stuck to its sort of feet appendages, which it will then, when it's we think when it's scared, basically when it's being attacked by predators, it will throw those glowing orbs into the water and they'll kind of burst into light and it shock that predator into maybe waiting for a second and being a bit unsure what's going on while that worm gets to swim off into the dark and into safety. And gossamer worms also have this similar sort of thing. They emit a yellow sparkling light into the water around them. We think probably also as a kind of a defense against predators. And this light, we think, is used for all sorts of things by animals in the deep ocean, to communicate to each other, to find mates, to actually see through the water. They can actually use lights under their eyes to see where they're going. So light, the deep ocean, the midnight zone may not have any sunlight, but it really is quite a bright, flashing, firework lit place. And we're still learning so much more about what that sort of bioluminescence is used for. But it makes perfect sense if you think about it. If these animals here are living in the permanent dark, day or night, there's no sunlight. So it makes perfect sense that it would be an incredibly adaptive thing to be able to do, a very useful thing to be able to do, make your own light and control it and switch it on and off as you want to. And that's what these worms and lots of other animals in the deep midnight zone have evolved to do many, many times. All sorts of things, octopuses, jellyfish, fish, all sorts of things have this extraordinary ability to make their own light. Now, I want to pause, actually. First of all, I'll say the depth of the midnight zone, down to 2.5 miles. The marble that I dropped from the top of our ship up on the surface is going to take another 1.5 hours to pass through the midnight zone. So it's a really huge depth. And I want to pause here, though, as well, to talk about some other animals that occupy, really for quite a lot of their lives, actually. They occupy both the twilight and the midnight zones. And these are sperm whales. I thought it might be quite appropriate, especially for a talk based out of Nantucket, to talk about these wonderful animals. And in particular, I write about them in the book. I'm going to just stop showing the slide just for a second so you can show. I'm going to read you a short piece from the book. And the reason, I saw some sperm whales while I was doing some research for the book down in the Gulf of Mexico. It was the first time I'd ever seen them, and I was very excited to lay eyes on these wonderful creatures. But also, I think sperm whales play a really significant role in our human connections to the deep oceans. Because as I mentioned earlier, there was a long time when people didn't really think that any life could occupy the deep ocean. Scientists were convinced that life basically ran out at a few thousand feet, perhaps, maybe the top 1,000 feet. But actually, it was whalers and people hunting for things like sperm whales who knew long before that life goes very deep indeed, and that these whales go very deep. They were really the first ones to comprehend that the deep ocean was not empty at all. Because what they would do is they were harpooning whales and using great big loops of rope to sort of tire them out. And these ropes came in specific lengths. So in the 19th century, American whalers commonly used ropes that were 225 fathoms long, or 1,350 feet. And often they actually needed to join 3 or 4 of these together before the whale succumbed. Now, even if those sperm whales, which they were hunting, even if they didn't dive directly downwards, but perhaps at a bit of an angle, it's still a very long way down that they were going at the end of these long ropes. And so, they really had the sense that, of course, these whales could go deep. And what they were also finding as they were hunting them was finding the remains in their stomachs of squid, a very large squid, which they were presumably also hunting down in these great depths. I just want to read you a little bit from the book, which is a quote that I really like from Moby Dick, which is a point at which Captain Ahab is conversing with the decapitated head of a sperm whale as it's hanging off the side of the whaling ship Pequod. And he says, "Speak, thou vast and vulnerable head, tell us the secret thing that is in thee. Of all divers, thou hast dived the deepest. That head upon which the upper sun now gleams has moved amid this world's foundations." I really love the way he talks about the world's foundations and where these animals live. So sperm whales, we've known, or people have known for hundreds of years, that they do go incredibly deep. But what we've more recently discovered is what it is they're actually doing down there. So we have this sense that, yeah, sure, they must be hunting. Presumably they're hunting for that squid down there because they come up with bellyfuls of the hard beaks that are indigestible in their stomachs. But how do they do it? And some wonderful science has helped to us to unpick this sort of mystery of what sperm whales get up to down there. And I just want to read you a little bit more about what we now know about sperm whale hunting. So here we go. In contrast to the lyrical, haunting song of a humpback whale, the sperm whale's sound is more like the crackle of a roll of adhesive tape being unwound. It makes an impressive racket. This is the most powerful sound in the animal kingdom. Emanating from the sperm whale's huge block-shaped head, which is in fact an overgrown nose. The sources of its noises are snorts of air pushed along its right nostril tube, which isn't connected to the outside. Sound pulses bounce around inside this giant nose, where a series of fluid-filled chambers shape and focus the vibrations and direct them into the water. In the 1980s, the so-called biological Big Bang hypothesis suggested that sperm whales hunt with sound, acoustically debilitating their prey. But subsequent studies have shown the calls are not loud enough for that. Instead, sperm whales search for and pursue their prey using bursts of echolocating sound, like giant aquatic versions of bats. When a sperm whale's hunt begins, it sends volleys of clicks through the deep, 1 or 2 per second. This long-range sonar interrogates the darkness, leaving any squid within thousands of feet nowhere to hide. The whale listens for echoes bouncing off hard body parts, such as the squid's snapping parrot-like beak and the rings of teeth arranged on suckers along 8 arms and at the end of 2 tentacles. Approaching a target, the hunting whale quickens its clicks until they blend together into a creak like a rusty door hinge. Bats do similar things, adjusting their acoustic gaze as they prepare to swoop for an insect, and generating more sound beams to make out extra details of their fluttering prey. Squid seem oblivious to the whale's clicks and creaks, but might sense ripples in the water. So as it approaches, the sperm whale stops beating its tail and glides onwards through the dark, stalking its prey. When the moment comes to attack, the whale puts on a burst of speed, moving up to 23 feet per second. It twists and turns, firing more shots of sound and chasing the squid as it tries to escape. Once within striking distance, the whale brakes and sharply turns, sucking in the squid and swallowing it whole. So that is the story of the giant squid, of the giant squid being hunted by sperm whales. And sperm whales spend about 3/4 of their lives down in the deep ocean. So they really are kind of inhabitants of the deep that really almost just visit the surface to recharge their oxygen and go back down when they need to and carry on the hunt. They'll spend a good hour at a time down in the twilight and midnight zones hunting mostly for squid, sometimes fish as well. So that is one of the extraordinary connections, I think, between the surface and the deep that we've known about for a long time, and which has been incredibly important. The hunting of those sperm whales to provide their oil from the spermaceti was powering very much of the industrializing world, lighting our world, producing very fine oils to illuminate the surface seas in lighthouses and things like that. So that's is I think enough on sperm whales. Let's move on, because basically I want to tell you how this is not the deepest part of the ocean. The midnight zone doesn't go all the way to the bottom, although that is roughly the average depth of the oceans, is that kind of 2.5 miles region, but it carries on down. And if we were to drop our marble in a region that does have a deeper range, it would drop into the next zone, which is beneath the midnight zone, and we call it the abyssal zone. Now, the word abyss is quite a general term, and in the book I use it not specifically to mean this bit. It has previous literary meanings of this still dark, unknowable places that you're not going to return from. But scientifically, it is now really applied to the deeper parts of the ocean beyond 2 miles or so. And what we find when we look in the abyssal zone are creatures like these that I've put you up on the screen here, which are very delicate-bodied creatures. I mean, we might look at them and think they're jellyfish. Only some of the jelly creatures that live in the deep ocean actually are technically what we would refer to scientifically as jellyfish. A lot of the other ones are various relatives, reasonably close relatives of the true jellyfish. But things like siphonophores, this beautiful orange creature at the top, actually a colony of animals living together. Some other relatives of jellyfish, the narcomedusae and the trachymedusae, have wonderful names. And the thing that's really bizarre, I find, about all of this, or perhaps what at first seems rather strange, is that we're descending into depths of the ocean that have incredibly high pressure. That's one of the extreme challenges of living in this deep parts of the ocean, just because we've got all that huge weight of water pushing down from above. And yet what we see living here are very delicate jelly-based creatures, these jellyfish of various types. And you might think, well, that's rather a contradiction. But again, a bit like the light makers of the midnight zone and other parts of the deep, these jelly creatures have evolved for a pretty good reason. And that is that the deep ocean, especially the deeper you go, is a very hungry place. There's really not much food down there. There's no sunlight beyond the twilight zone, so there's no sun to power the machinery inside of plants and algae and seaweeds that harness the energy of the sun, so photosynthesis. There's no photosynthesis. There's no new food being made down in the deep ocean. We've got nothing that would resemble the base of the food web that we have out on land, which is, all the plants that get eaten, and then the animals eat the plants, and so on up the food chain. But we don't have that in the deep ocean. All we really have are fragments of that production that we get in the surface seas, falling down from above, and we call this stuff marine snow. This picture here shows you those particles, those spots, sort of constellations, dots in the background, are basically little particles of carbon-rich organic matter falling down through the ocean. It sounds lovely, marine snow. It's not quite as nice as it sounds. It's basically bits of dead plankton, so tiny little animals, tiny algae that live in the surface seas. When they die, they will fall down into the deep ocean. They'll clump together into these white fluffy particles that we call marine snow. But it's incredibly important. It's one of the main sources of food for much of the deep ocean. This sort of constant but also varying rain of carbon coming down from above. And things like jellyfish will catch that on the way down. So actually there's less and less of it. And by the time you get down into the abyss, at most around 2% of the food that's being made up in the shallows can make it down into the deep ocean. So it's a hungry place, which means that to survive down there, it's a good idea, and evolution takes us towards the point where a lot of organisms are very efficient in the way they live. So you don't want to be rushing around using big muscles that need lots of oxygen and lots of food, but being basically a bag of water or jelly is a very efficient way to build a body and to operate and to basically float around. You're quite neutrally buoyant. And so this body form, this jelly-based body form, is actually a great adaptation for life down in these great depths. And it's actually quite pressure resistant as well. So that huge pressure actually isn't a problem if you happen to be made out of jelly, which so many creatures, and very beautiful creatures as well, living down in these abyssal depths, create their bodies from this efficient and cheap source of building material, really, which is the jelly. So we have the abyssal zone full of delicate jelly creatures, but we still haven't quite reached the bottom of the ocean. Our marble is still dropping down and down, and it's going to get, finally, my aim is good. In fact, I think we'd have to, if our sailing boat was coming out of Nantucket, I think we'd have to head down to the Caribbean to drop the marble into one of the very greatest depths, which are the ocean trenches, and the realm that we call the Hadal Zone. Now, here's some footage taken last summer in the Mariana Trench, which is in the Pacific Ocean. It's the deepest trench we have. And these are V-shaped chasms that form in the bottom of the seabed in various parts of the world. And they are the deepest points we have. Many of them are, tens of thousands of feet. Hopefully you can see there. I'm actually covered up. I can't quite see, but I think it's about 23,000 feet this particular image was taken. And as I've got there, the pressure is about 4.5 tons per square inch, or the same roughly as a very large elephant squashing down on every square inch of the body of the animals down there, including this is the snailfish, this white creature swimming past us. The deepest dwelling vertebrate that we know of. They go down to around this depth. They live in trenches. There's usually 1 or 2 species that we know of so far that live in a particular trench. Or I should say the Hadal Zone is named after Hades, the Greek underworld, because it really is a fairly hellish place down there if you're not adapted like these creatures are to living under such high pressure. These animals also have quite a lot of jelly in their bodies. They're quite flabby, jelly-like creatures, and we think that's another adaptation for this great pressure, and the fact that they also don't have a huge amount of food. But there is stuff for them to eat. And the other things you can see in this picture are those white things swimming around are amphipods. They're a type of crustacean, so relatives of crabs and shrimp. You've got some red shrimp there in the background as well. But the key creatures that are important in trenches are these guys, the amphipods, which are scavengers. They feed on mostly marine snow, things that have falling down, dead things falling down into trenches. This is a baited camera. So what they're feeding on is actually a bunch of fish that the scientists have put down with this camera to attract these scavengers. And then the snailfish eats the amphipods. That's their staple diet, basically, are amphipods that are these scavengers. And it's quite a simple food web, but it works. And those animals are surviving down at these extraordinarily deep depths where there's very little food. The pressure is extraordinarily high, but they have found a way. And if we did perhaps we could sail down to Puerto Rico, drop the marble down into the bottom of the Puerto Rico Trench, which is a similar depth. They're all incredibly deep. The marble would take 6 hours to get to the bottom. That's how big the deep ocean is. How deep it is. It really is. It's an extraordinarily huge realm, and it is very hard to wrap our heads around just how much water that is. This is a drawing from the book, which was done by fabulous artist Aaron John Gregory from California, who does the front covers of my English published books over here in Britain, and he's done this wonderful map on the end papers of this, the hard copy for the US version. And this is basically what the planet would look like without any water in it. And you can see that there's mountain ranges, there are these amazingly deep trenches, that go down incredibly deep, and all of these amazing features. So the deep seabed is not this single kind of uniform space, but it's very rich geographically and geologically with all sorts of different features, and with that all sorts of different animals and things that are living in this. That's just down on the seabed. And then if we think about the water column above that, the volume of the deep ocean is extraordinarily big. I mean, waters deeper than 660 feet cover roughly half of the planet. And so if we multiply all that up, we get this enormous volume. It's around about 1 billion cubic kilometers. Again, a ridiculously big number, very hard to wrap your head around. If the Amazon Amazon River were to fill up the deep ocean, that's not how the deep ocean was filled, but just imagine it was the biggest river we have. If it was pouring down from the bottom to fill up to that 660 feet level, it would take around 150,000 years for it to fill up. So this is representing roughly 95% of the living space on our planet, the biosphere, the space available for organisms to occupy. So if we want to know life on Earth, we absolutely have to look into the deep ocean. Here, so many extraordinary things are to be found, from sperm whales to those beautiful jellies and swimming worms and hagel snailfish living all the way down in the bottom, and so much more for us to discover as well. I think that combination of the varied geography, the fact that life differs where you go in different parts of the deep ocean, is and the huge scale, is why we are finding so much more every time people go and look and study different parts of the deep ocean. We find new species, we find new ecosystems, new life, all sorts of things, and so much more still to discover. It really is an exciting time for science in the deep ocean, because we've got amazing tools, amazing people, and amazing brains thinking about this wonderful space. And the more we look into the deep ocean, the more it's really obvious just how important it is. This is just a depiction of one aspect of that, which is the heat that moves through the deep ocean. If it wasn't for this vast volume of water on our planet, we would basically it would be uninhabitable. The equator would just get hotter and hotter, the poles would get colder and colder. But what we have depicted in this picture here is this basically huge conveyor belt of a huge river basically pouring around on a 1,000-year journey around the planet, down through the deep ocean from pole to pole, through the tropics, distributing heat as it goes, and making many parts of the planet, the parts that we live in now, habitable. So certainly here over in Western Europe, we have the Gulf Stream to thank, and that current of water coming across the Atlantic is keeping us much warmer than we would be otherwise. So we have that to thank for. The deep ocean also is absorbing something like 90% of the heat that's been trapped by climate change, by the greenhouse gas blanket we have on our planet now. If it wasn't for that huge volume of the ocean, we'd already have a ridiculously, unthinkably bad version of the climate crisis. Something like 30 degrees Celsius increase, which I think is around 80 Fahrenheit, something like that. That's how much warmer it would be already on surface temperatures would just be skyrocketing if the oceans and the deep oceans weren't there to cool everything down. So the deep ocean really does matter. And for other reasons too. Other scientists also are looking down into the deep ocean at incredible ecosystems that could offer us some pretty powerful new ideas and chemistry that we could find to be quite useful in the years ahead. In particular, we're looking at corals and sponges living in the deep ocean. These are a mixture on the screen I've shown you here. These beautiful creatures are corals, which I certainly didn't know not so long ago, that there were so many corals living down in the deep ocean. Half of the species we know, more than half actually, of corals aren't ones that build beautiful reefs up in the shallows like the barrier reef, but actually live down in the deep depths beyond the reach of sunlight. And some of them live for hundreds, some thousands of years. Some of the specimens have been aged to more than 4,000 years. And these colonies growing and living in the same places. Sponges too are animals, but they don't look like it. This yellow chap on the top left-hand corner is a sponge. They can also live for a very long time. They produce all sorts of toxic chemicals, partly probably to defend themselves. These guys can't move their animals, but they could be eaten by other things that might find them tasty. So a lot of the time they're producing chemicals, a bit like plants do, to make themselves inedible and to stop things from munching on them. And they also have a lot of bacteria and bugs living in them, which themselves produce some really interesting chemistry and stuff that we're just not seeing anywhere else. They're sort of molecules and chemistry that are just completely different from anything on land, and often really toxic, which is what we want, actually, if we're searching for ideas for new medicines, which is what this is all about. Often these sorts of searches for corals and sponges happen on seamounts, these incredible features that we see all the way through the deep ocean, dotted around thousands, probably millions of giant volcanoes that rise up thousands of feet but don't actually reach the surface. Some of them active, some of them dormant, but these huge features are often where you find corals growing. It's nice hard ground for them to grow on, and you get these incredible forests of corals and sponges. And that's where scientists increasingly are going to look for, taking small samples of these corals, bringing them back in sponges and looking at the chemistry inside them and seeing what sort of stuff we can find in there and what kind of uses it might have. And already we've got some really promising molecules coming out and being put into what we call the drug discovery pipeline. So ideas for new drugs that we need, including one from this one, the Venus flower basket sponge, which is from the Northeast Atlantic. So somewhere between where you and I are sitting right now, these things grow down in the deep. And one of the chemicals pulled out of these things so far is shown to be really powerful, potently toxic to the superbug, MRSA, one of these bacteria that cause problems in humans, but are very difficult to treat because they've got resistance to the antibiotics that we already have. So what we need are new antibiotics, and this could potentially be a source of one of those. It's one of these things where there are just really shocking projections. Perhaps by 2050, something like 10 million people a year could be dying from infections that can't be treated unless we find a new effective ways of dealing with these sorts of resistant bugs. And maybe we'll find them in the deep. It could be. I think we're so much potential is coming out of this area from corals and sponges and all sorts of things people are looking at. And you don't need to take much. It's not like harvesting these drugs from the deep. It's just finding the chemicals and then taking them into the lab, working at what they are, perhaps tweaking them, and then figuring out are they going to be useful as potentially new drugs. So there's huge potential for all sorts of things that we're finding down in the deep ocean. And but as well as that, so we've got, we're discovering new places, we're discovering potentially new useful stuff, we're finding out what aspects of the deep link into our daily lives and perhaps into the future too, to help save lives. But I want to finish off with another, a particular part of the deep ocean that was only discovered around 40 years ago. A particular habitat that we now find all over the place. And it was only at that point it was first discovered. And it's showing us, I think, something even more important about, well, a particularly exciting thing about the deep ocean, which is it's really challenging our views of what life can be and how life can exist. And I'm just going to play this video as an introduction. I'm sure some of you may already know about these places, but they really are quite wondrous. So I'm just going to play this for you now.
So right now we are at a depth of 3,275 meters, looking at an incredible black smoker hydrothermal vent chimney. That black fluid coming out there is likely between 300 and 400 degrees centigrade. These ecosystems are literally islands or oases amongst what is, I mean, it's really cliche, and the deep sea is definitely not a desert, but relatively islands of abundant fauna, islands of life in what is a usually desert-like deep sea flow. Oh, this is so cool! What? About 27 meters high? 30 meters high.
So hydrothermal vents. Hydrothermal vents were first discovered around about here. I don't know if you can see my my marker there, but in this eastern Pacific, near the Galapagos Islands, in the late 70s, and there was a bunch of geologists who first were looking. They found these thermal anomalies in the ocean in water temperatures and had wondered what was down there. So they actually went down in the deep diving submersible Alvin out of Woods Hole, which still exists, and looked out of the window and just saw this oasis. As we just heard from that scientist, these oases of life. We now know that they form all through the oceans at the edges of tectonic plates. The red dots here are ones that people have looked at. The yellow ones are ones we think exist, but no one's actually checked yet. And so there's hundreds of these vent fields forming. And just quickly show you how they do. The idea is that you get seawater percolating through cracks in the seabed and getting heated up by chambers of magma, these volcanic chambers at really high temperatures, just in the shallow, relatively shallow down in the seabed. So this is a part of the world where parts of the tectonic plates are pulling apart. Generally, that's where they are. And then there's hot magmas sort of bubbling up to the surface, heating this water, which then flows back up and gushes out of the seabed into these tall chimneys, which is where metals and various other elements get deposited into these craggy formations. And this really scorching fluids pour out of the top. And the pressure is so high down here. We're talking several miles down in sort of the abyssal zone, really. It's so high that the fluids don't boil. So you get, it's like a hot spring, but like an extreme hot spring, like hot spring on land, but like way more hot, way more toxic, and an extraordinary place. It's just an extreme environment. Not the sort of place you would expect to find life at all, except you do. One of the first animals that was discovered on these vents were the giant tube worms, these 6 feet long, crazy things. And it was these that revealed the real secret and the really exciting thing, I think. I mean, visually, these places are stunning. They're very wonderful things to look at. But then the fact is that actually these revolutionized the view of life on Earth. Because up until then, it was assumed that to have life, for life to exist, requires a sun, requires a star pouring energy and sunlight down and onto that planet. And for photosynthesis, those plants I mentioned earlier, the seaweeds and things, to harness that energy to make food for basically everything else. And then along comes this new ecosystem. The hydrothermal vents do things completely differently. They do it all in the dark. They have this dark alternative to photosynthesis. We call it chemosynthesis. And basically it's microbes, small little bacteria and other microbes that can harness not the sun's energy, because there isn't any, it's totally dark down there, but they harness chemical energy. And that's the basis for this entire ecosystem. Many of them live inside these creatures as symbiotic partners. That's what you find in these tube worms. They've got bacteria living inside them which harness those chemicals, things like hydrogen sulfide and methane that are coming out of those vents. That's what they use to make basically food, carbohydrates for the worms, which they then absorb inside them. Some of the others, this is one of my favourite creatures on hydrothermal vents. These are Yeti crabs, or these are a type of Yeti crab that live off of Antarctica. And what they do is they have bacteria growing in the hairs on their bodies. Some have hairy arms, that's why they're called Yeti crabs. These ones are actually nicknamed Hoff crabs because they have hairy chests that were named after David Hasselhoff. If you're a big fan of Baywatch, you might appreciate that. That's just their common name. They do have a proper science name too, which is Kiwa tyleri. And they have these bacteria that are harnessing chemicals, and they basically just eat those. They grow on the outsides of their bodies, and that's how they get their energy. Then moving on, just one last animal I'm going to show you before we move to questions is the scalyfoot snail. These are very weird creatures that have iron, basically made their shells out of iron, and they have these weird feet covered in iron scales too, and they also have bacteria that are helping them to feed. And what I want to just mention finally is that these particular snails are really an icon of the threats that are happening down in the deep ocean, which is the sort of second part of the book that I come to after talking about all the wonderful scientific explorations that we have. We're also threatening the deep like we haven't in new ways. And this is the kind of icon for that, these snails, because they only live in 3 places in the Indian Ocean, these 3 hydrothermal vents in this map here. And 2 of them are being explored for the potential to set up mines. So people are considering mining hydrothermal vents for the metals inside those tall black chimney smokers, black smoker chimneys. So these guys are the first species to be listed as endangered of extinction because of the threat of deep sea mining. Now, mining is not only potentially going to happen, there's none yet, but they're coming up quite quickly. The idea of doing that potentially is going to start happening in the next couple of years. As well as vents, people are looking at mining seamounts. So there's places where there's wonderful corals grow, and abyssal plains where there's these incredible rocks that are also made of very metal-rich rocks, so that take millions of years to form and actually have their own ecosystems and important stuff going on there. but this is just one threat. I mean, we can talk more perhaps in the Q&A if you want to know more about mining, and that's certainly something I feel very passionate about. There are other threats to the ocean too. We're fishing deeper than we ever have before. There are also some plastic waste getting to the deep ocean. Here's a shrimp, an amphipod from the Mariana Trench, and its name was named after what was found in its stomach, Erythenes plasticus. So we are pushing more threats into the deep ocean than ever before. But I do think we're at a really important time where we could actually, humanity could decide that we don't have to exploit the deep ocean. There's not really any convincing argument in favor of doing that, of mining, of fishing down there. But actually we could just decide to leave it alone. And a bit like we do with, we have done. 60 years ago, Antarctica was set aside as a place of peace and science. And internationally that was agreed upon, and it still holds today. And I would really think that the deep ocean could be also one of those places which we decide is too special and too important and too fragile to exploit. And we could just say that we're not going to do that. And I wanted just to finish very, very quickly reading you just a really short part from the end of the book, just to get you a sense of some of the other things I've been writing about. So not so long ago, the deep sea was a tremendous void containing only myths, legends, and endless unknowns. Today, we know a great deal, and tomorrow we'll know more. Whenever and wherever someone explores, the window into the living deep opens a little wider, and more details come into view. And yet, our accumulated knowledge still shrinks in comparison to what remains to be discovered and learned from this enormous space. And perhaps John Steinbeck would have preferred it that way. An ocean without its unnamed monsters would be like a completely dreamless sleep, he wrote in his book, The Log of the Sea of Cortez. The deep sea will never run out of things for us to dream about. Places will remain unseen and unvisited. Fleeting moments will be missed, and nimble creatures, whose existence nobody can guess, will keep slipping out of sight. We need to do all we can to keep it that way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen. That was amazing. There's a lot of directions we could go. I'm going to start you off with an easy yes/no question, just to soften things up a bit. So Nancy wants to know if all of the illustrations in your presentation today are included in your book.
Many of them are, not all of them. There is a color insert in the middle. Certainly some of those really colorful guys I was showing you, some of those might be quite familiar to you from what I've just shown you. Some other ones you haven't seen, so there's more to see there too. So yeah, we do, and also some snails and things. Those are the scaly foot snails, which are wonderful. Some corals and things. So yeah, there's a few pages of those guys in there, yeah.
All right. So Tim, I believe he wrote this question around the point where you were talking about the vents and the creatures that live around the vents. The question is, what do these deep smokers tell us about the deep Earth climate and magnetic field shifts?
Oh, wow. Well, one thing I do know is that there's a very important cycling that happens through these vents. So I forget exactly how long it is, but there's sort of a turnover for how often that the whole of the oceans basically pours through vents within, I think, several thousand years. I'd have to double check in the book. It is in there somewhere. But there is this kind of circulation going through vents, and there's a really important exchange of chemicals going on there, of dissolving chemicals that are in the seabed, bringing them into the ocean and keeping things in balance. So, the vents have been kind of described as the chemical reactor of the ocean that are keeping things in balance, the chemistry in balance. So they're very important that way. I'm not quite sure. I don't know much about the magnetic part of that question, but I would say that seamounts, which is something else we were talking about, they certainly have an effect on the geomagnetic fields, and we think that might possibly be how some animals migrate and navigate between seamounts. So sharks and turtles and whales and things, we think use them as sort of waypoints through the ocean, and possibly that geomagnetic anomaly, because they're big and very dense, could be partly how they're doing that.
And then there's a question here that asks, what stories do the sediments tell? The
sediments tell very long stories. So the deep, ocean, I was quite shocked to find out in the research for the book just how much mud there is. Like there's miles of mud. So in some parts, especially in the Pacific, because the Pacific is the oldest ocean. It's the biggest and the oldest ocean. So sediments have been pouring in from rivers and from land for a very, very long time, for millions, about 250 million years. And so a lot is built up. And in some places, to get to the seabed, you have to get through several miles of mud first, of drilling down. And you're getting layers of deposition and all sorts of things that scientists can pull out of that. The chemistry of past oceans, the temperatures, the organisms that lived there. Reconstructing ancient oceans from those from the sediment cores, and also reconstructing the impact humans are having. So just off the coast of California a few years ago, a sediment core, actually it was taken a bit before that, but kept in storage, and it was looked at again. And basically, scientists were looking at the plastic pollution and showed that it was appearing as of the mid-1940s. These particles were being deposited in this very still part of the ocean that weren't being stirred up by animals and things. And you've just got this layer building up, and it follows the concentration of particles of plastics in that sediment towards the present day. It follows the production of plastics, almost exactly. So it's showing our increased impact, and it's really kind of showing that we're putting plastic into that almost the fossil record. Really, we are changing that marker of our presence on the planet, but down in the deep ocean.
And speaking of plastics, there is a question. I just have to get down to it. My mouse
there's one here. Is this the one about marine snow?
I'm looking in the chat, and it just asked about microplastics and how much of a have microplastics become a part of the marine snow. That one.
Yeah. Yes, yes, it actually absolutely has. A team out of Monterey Bay Research Institute. Again in California, they were looking at this exact thing. They're taking samples all the way down through the open water and showing that there is that there's this kind of plasticization of marine snow and from other animals that are catching it too. So you've got these kind of jelly-based creatures that I was telling you about, various other things that are filtering the water, and they're picking up plastic particles. And we think what they discovered, at least in Monterey Bay, is like a concentration. I think at around about, I may be wrong on this, but maybe at around about 1,000 feet down, there was like a real concentration of plastic in that zone for some reason, which we don't quite understand why. But there is definitely this rain coming down, and it is getting into the food web. The consequences of that we don't quite understand at this point, but we certainly know that it's happening, and that animals are, they are eating and ingesting these particles coming down. Yeah.
Okay, and we have two questions that are somewhat related, so I'm going to combine them into one, but they both have to do with the size of animals at deep depths. And one asks, aside from sperm whales, is there a trend in terms of the size of animals living in the deep? And then the other one asks, how big do the clams and crabs near the vents get?
Oh, good questions. Yeah. So two things we see often in terms of evolution in the deep ocean of animals that are maybe groups that we'd be familiar with in the shallow seas. And there's two things that they can do if they invade and come down into deeper waters. One is they can get really tiny, and one is they can get really big. And depending on the groups, you kind of see either, some groups, like some snails, for example, can be much smaller than their relatives up in the shallower seas, and some are really massive. So one example is there are things called giant isopods, and they are relatives of woodlice. I think you guys call them pill bugs. Is that right? The little guys you find in the garden hiding under plant pots, and they roll up in a ball when they get scared. And you wouldn't expect them to be too big, right? In the deep ocean, their cousins are the size of footballs and pink. And they are enormous. So they giant isopods, and we saw them in the Gulf of Mexico on the expedition we did. And that's because, I guess both of those ways, like getting small and also getting big, is actually a response to that lack of food. So one thing you can do is be little and not require too much food, or evolution can take you in the get bigger zone, which is what these isopods do. And they have enormous fat stores in their bodies. They're big and they're basically fatty. They eat at once, perhaps every 4 years. They eat things like, they'll scavenge basically anything that falls down, dead stuff, bigger dead stuff, including whales and other things that will fall to the seabed. they'll feed when they can find one and then just hide out for a couple of years, feeding off that sort of the reserves they've built up in their bodies. So it can go either way, basically. Oh, and the clams can be big. There's dinner plate sized clams on hydrothermal vents, but the crabs are quite little. The Hoff crabs and the Yeti crabs, I think, would sort of sit on the palm of your hand. The males tend to be bigger. They're a bit more foolhardy, and they go closer to those vents where all those chemistry is happening, all those chemicals are coming out. But it's dangerous because it's really hot up there. And the females generally hang back and look after their eggs in slightly safer and cooler zones. But they don't have as much food because they haven't got those chemicals bathing them, but potentially cooking them at the same time. So, you know, it's one of those things where you have to balance it out. Yeah.
Sounds like a complicated place.
It is pretty, yeah.
Yeah. So for these last two questions, I'm also going to combine them together because they're a little related. They have to do with the differences between the different zones. So one person asked how the nature of the water changes between the zones, and another person asked if a hadal zone creature could move between zones, and if they do, what happens?
So, I mean, we know that some of the conditions are changing quite predictably as you're going down to deeper waters. Like, well, it gets colder to a point where it kind of plateaus to around 2 degrees Celsius. Sorry, I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit, but it basically gets colder and then just keeps at that kind of red steady cold. So around just a little bit above freezing. The pressure obviously is kind of just continually ramping up the deeper down you go. And then you get, like, depending so perhaps more geographically on where you are in the world, different chemistries, different current flows, that kind of thing, you do get areas. A really important thing that happens in the deep ocean is actually this reversal, an upwelling current, which brings nutrients from deeper waters up to the surface, and actually that's feeding some really rich ecosystems. Something like a quarter of all the fish caught in the shallow seas come from these deep upwelling areas along the generally on the western coast of continents, so off West Africa, off the western coast of South America. You get these really rich sardine fisheries, things like that, and they're really fed by these upwelling waters from the deep, where nutrients are being released by the food web down below, and they're coming back to the surface. So you get a really important mixing happening there. Hydrothermal vents also play a role. We've recently, a study came out showing that these fluids coming up, oftentimes they have a lot of iron in them, and that's actually belting up to the surface and fertilizing plankton and causing blooms of plankton in the shallow seas. So you get a lot of exchange going both up and down the water column from the deep. And then, sorry, what was the other part of the question? So we talked about the chemistry and...
So if a creature that lives in the hadal zone...
Oh, yes, if it would move. Yes. So, well, one thing I didn't touch on, but is in the book, is that from the twilight zone, every night there is a huge migration to the surface and back again. So there's a whole range of organisms, jellyfish, fish, squid, which under the cover of darkness will actually come to the surface every night, and they feed in the surface waters where they're less likely to be caught and eaten by other things because it's dark. And then when the sun rises, they go back down, and they do that every night. So it's like the biggest migration on the planet. It's happening basically up and down everywhere on the planet every day. So they're fine. They can deal with that change in pressure. They're adapted to that change. But there are other animals that really don't do well if you bring them up and basically fall apart. So some of those jelly creatures, there's one amazing thing which is called a dinner plate jelly, again a kind of dinner plate size, and it's quite a voracious predator, and it hunts around in the midnight zone for other animals. But if you bring one up, it pretty much just falls between your fingers. That's it. Some of them are tough though, so I haven't seen this myself because I haven't been on a trip to the Indian Ocean, but those scaly foot snails that I was telling you about, these guys, the lady who studies these tells me that you can bring these up and they will be fine, and they can crawl around on your hand, and they actually don't mind being brought to the surface. So they're okay. And then you mentioned the question was about hadal zone, and one thing we don't know actually is whether these snailfish, which live down in these trenches in the hadal zone, if they come up and go into others, or maybe the juveniles do. We don't know if they just stay in that trench or if they move around. That's one part of the mystery of the deep that still has to be solved. So watch this space. We might find out one day.
So I'm going to give the last question to my colleague Janet, and then we'll call it an evening.
Thank you.
Yeah, the question I had was about, and I think of this when I hear about the study of space, is like it's a similar challenge in that how do humans get there because they can't live there or adapt or even breathe? And I was wondering, kind of two parts, in recent history, what's been some really breakthrough technology that's allowed you to do your research? And if you had a magic wand and could create a new technology that would make things easier, what would it be?
Ooh, that's a great question. No, I really like the parallels that we draw between exploring space and the deep ocean, because as you say, it's two similar kind of challenges, places that we generally can't go without immense life support. It's also hard to kind of see it and study it, but we send probes and robots, and that, I would say, those are the kind of breakthroughs that are really opening up the science of the deep ocean, is incredible remote technologies. As much as putting people there is exciting and important, I think, for making those connections and have exploration of these places, we are learning so much more by sending machines in our place that are able to do things that we can't. There are things that humans can do that machines can't. They're good at seeing bioluminescence, for example, which is actually quite hard to film. They're working on cameras that are actually able to detect bioluminescence in situ, whereas mostly what we know about bioluminescence is from creatures brought to the surface and kept in aquariums, and we study them that way. But actually in the deep, it's quite hard to film those things. You need very sensitive cameras. But again, some teams from Mbari and in California are working on that. So I would say that the step changes in those kinds of technologies. So we have these remote operated underwater vehicles, which were originally developed for the oil and gas industry, for the kind of offshore drilling. And scientists have now taken those and using basically deep diving robots with amazing cameras and arms you can control from the surface, and sending those guys down is opening up incredible views, watching behaviors, so seeing animals in the deep. Because I think that, for me, actually is the crux, really, of why there is such an exciting time for science in the deep ocean, is because we're seeing it in ways we never did before. Sure, since middle of the 19th century, incredible studies have been done to bringing animals up and understanding what the sperm whales are doing down there and all that kind of stuff. But actually seeing them and watching them is such an incredibly powerful thing that we now have. And they're live streamed. Like, go and check them out. Like, incredible expeditions that are taking these machines and actually live streaming them to the internet, so you can sit at home and be like a remote explorer. I never get any work done those days when it's being broadcast, because it's just extraordinary to watch in almost real time, the view of the side of a seamount or a hydrothermal vent or whatever it is they're looking at that day. So for me, that is those eyes in the deep, I think, is the real revolution. If I had a magic wand, though, well, I don't know. I think maybe it would be some kind of combination of the things that we can do put together into one machine. So yeah, something with an incredible camera that could just capture everything that was there, combined with a DNA sequencer that would grab some water and identify the name of the species from the DNA it shed in the water and just before it swam out of sight. So you could say, yeah, it was a giant squid, or it was something else that we just missed catching. So maybe kind of genetics combined with visuals, and combining all of these different aspects that help us to understand what's there and how it lives, and make those connections. If we can kind of visualize those ecosystem connections by doing that, I think that would be super cool. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. You've certainly given us a lot to think about. And, your energy and your enthusiasm for the deep ocean has sparked my curiosity. So do you have any final words for us before we call it a night?
Well, just say thank you so much for watching and for your questions. And if you do get a chance to have a look at the book, I'd love to know what you think of it. Really, the idea of it is to show what we're learning about this incredible part of our planet, and really how I think we need to think more carefully about what happens down there and the impacts that humans are having. There's a lot of going on with the deep sea mining issue at the moment. A lot of big decisions are potentially going to be made in the next couple of months, a couple of years, that really could set this down a certain path. So if you are interested in those issues, I've been writing a bunch of stuff also in other places, because things have actually moved on already since I wrote the book, which is extraordinary. The book also shows a bit of history coming up to how we got where we are today with mining and with fishing and things. So if you are interested in finding out more, do have a look, and I'd love to hear what you think. But most of all, just thank you so much for having me. It's been a huge pleasure.
And thank you for coming. And maybe someday, hopefully, we could get you in person on Nantucket.
Would love that. I would absolutely love that.
That would be great.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Then I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and thank Dr. Scales for sharing her wisdom with us tonight. And I wish you all a good night.
Take care. Thanks.